All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Baruch Fishel, thank you for the coffee. Good morning. Our shir this morning is dedicated by Ayal and Sarah Steinberg in honor of the yahrzeit of Ayal's mother, Elia Daphna Bas Yosef. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah Neshama will have an aliyah and a family in a chama. All right, Shabbosai, let's begin. I realized I forgot to record the rest of the daf from yesterday, so let's just pick up and we'll get through as much as we can today. So we'll say we're up to Last line on Yud Beis Amud Beis. So remember again, I will say in this particular situation, we were quoting the statement of Ben Azai. And Ben Azai wanted to prove that Ola is in the same category as Chatos and Pesach. Just like Chatos and Pesach Shalol Lishmam are going to be possible, so to Ola Shalol Lishmam is possible as well. So the Gemara tried to make a Mahatzad between these karbanos. The Gemara then rejected that Mahatzad. And the Gemara then says, so the Ola was included in that Ma'atzad because the Ma'atzad was anything that's Kodshim and Shachta Shalosh Shmo is possible. That's the Ma'atzad that's the common denominator between Pesach and Chatos. Ola fits that criteria as well. To which the Gemara says, Ma'ala Tzad HaShavah Shaba and Sheishba and Tzad Karis. Why don't you say that the common denominator between Pesach and Chatos is that they have a Tzad Karis? So remember again, the Karis is for two different ideas. Karis by chatos is because you only bring a chatos if you accidentally do something. That is a karis bearing prohibition. Pesach is if you don't offer karban Pesach, a person is chayiv karis. But nevertheless, they both have a karis common denominator. Ben Azai, tzad karis lo parich. So we'll say, top of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So Ben Azai says, ultimately again, that Ben Azai does not bring up the tzad karis. And Rashi points out, because Ben Azai felt karis can't be a common denominator, because even though there is an aspect of kares by Chatos and by Pesach, kares is different by both of them, meaning there's a different kares application. So because of that, it can't be a ma'atzad, to which the Gemara says, Asham nami laisi. If that's the case, the Gemara says, so why don't we also include Asham as being pasul shalol lishmo? So if the ma'atzad rabosai is anything that's kachim, and Shachta Shlosh Ma'as Psula, I can include Asham in that as well. Asham Parach, so the Gemara says, Asham Parach, Malatzad Hashava Shabahan, Sheken Yeshnan B'tzibur Kibiyachid. But I say, you want to bring in Asham won't work, and I'll tell you why. Because another common denominator between Pesach and between Ola is that what? Is that they both apply, they could both be brought communally as well as individually. Yet, again, Asham can only be brought as an individual carbon. Be by same. I will say the other possibility is sad kares nami parich. I will say the other possibility is no. You could even bring in the aspect of kares. Uben Azai Gemara Gamirlo. Ben Azai, I will say, just had a tradition. In other words, Ben Azai had this Mesorah from his Rebbe. Ultimately, that Ola is included. That Ola is included in the same category as Chatos and Pesach. And again, he doesn't learn it out from a Ma'atzad, he just simply learns it out from the Mesorah of his Rebbe. And that's what Rafuna brought down the Kavachomer. He only brought that down, I will say, for what purpose? To sharpen his Talmidim. In other words, that ultimately, again, that Kavachomer was not the real limud, but rather that Kavachomer was just then there to sharpen the skills of the Talmidim. So at the end of the day, we do not accept the position of Ben Azai. Ola is not in the same category as Chatos and Asham, and even though Chatos and Pesach, and even though Chatos and Pesach Shalol Lishmam, if they're off Shalol Lishmam are pasul, that will not apply to Asham. Good, says the Mishnah. HaPesach. So once we go back here. HaPesach ba'Chatos sheshachton Shalol Lishman. We'll say here we go. Fascinating Mishnah. Pesach and Chatos, they were shechted shalol lishman. In other words, they were shechted ultimately, again, not for their intended purpose. Kibel, v'halach, v'zach shalol lishman. Or so we'll say that's shchita. So if it is shchita shalol lishman, or Kabbalah. But remember again, Kabbalah is when the Kohen catches the blood in a kli. Or halach, which is halacha, taking the blood to the mizbeach. Or zarak, zrika, sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. Shalol lishman. We'll say if any of these things were done shalol lishman. Oh, Lishman v'shalol lishman, or if you did it lishman and shalol lishman, we'll define what that means in just a moment. Oh, shalol lishman or lishman, or you started out shalol lishman, then you went to lishman. We'll say in all of these cases, psulim. So we'll say there are two different halachas over here. Halacha number one is that the psul of shalol lishma applies to all of the four blood avodos: shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zerika. That's halacha number one. If you did any of those Shalol Lishma, ultimately, again, the Karban, specifically, again, the Pesach and the Chatos, will be possible. The additional piece that the Mishnah introduces to us to I say is that if you flip-flopped between Lishman and Shalol Lishman, that also will invalidate by these Karbanos. So the Gemara says, Ketzav Lishman, Shalol Lishman. What's the case of Lishman and Shalol Lishman? L'shem Pesach or L'shem Shlamim. We'll say that's where you started off the Karban. We'll say, let's say you did the Shechita L'shem Pesach, but you did the Kabbalah L'shem Shlamim. That's Lishman v'Shalol Lishman. Shalol Lishman or Lishman. What's the other case? L'shem Shlamim L'shem Pesach. Ultimately, we'll say that'd be a case, let's say where you did the Shechita L'shem Shlamim, but you did the Kabbalah L'shem Pesach. Shazevach nifsal ba'arba dvarim. Because we'll say a carbon can become invalidated if there is any type of psul in any of the four, what we call the four blood avodos. B'shchita, u'b'kibul, b'hiluch, u'b'zrika. Rabbi Shimon machshe b'hiluch. Rabbi Shimon says, if you have, let's say, shalol l'shma, you do something wrong in holacha, that will not invalidate the carbon. Why? Shahaya omer, i'afshar shalol b'shchita, v'shalol b'kabbalah, v'shalol b'zrika. A carbon must have shchita, kabbalah, and zrika. Aval efshar below hiluch. Rabbi say holacha is not an indispensable part of the carbonic process. Why not? Because shochet b'tzad mizbeach v'zorek. We'll say essentially, we spoke about this a few days ago. You could always shecht the animal right next to the mizbeach, and therefore what? And thereby avoid the need for halacha. You could do zrika right from there. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, hamahalich b'makom shutzarach lahalech machshava poselas. We'll say, so then Rabbi Eliezer is going to make an interesting statement, which we're not going to understand now, but the Gemara is going to explain it. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if you do halacha in a situation where you have to walk, where you have to do halacha, then if you have a machshava shalol shma, it passes the carbon. B'makom shenu tzarach lahalech, but if you do halacha in a place where halacha is not necessary, then what? Ein machshava poselas. Then Abba say an erroneous thought or shalol lishma thought will not invalidate the carbon. What Rabbi Eliezer means, we will see in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, the Kabbalah mi pasla. So Abba say, so now remember again, the Mishnah taught us a very important principle, which is that if, let's say, these karbanos, Pesach and Chatos, which become pasul if offered up shalol lishma, if there is a kavanah of shalol lishma during any one of the four blood avodos, shchita, kabbalah, zurika, holacha, that invalidates the carbon. The Gemara is intrigued by the Kabbalah idea. So you're telling me now that if the Kohen has a shalol lishma kavanah by Kabbalah, that invalidates the carbon. Is that true? Vatanya, I will say first wide line, you'd give a lamed aleph. Vatanya v'hikrivo ze Kabbalah sadam. When the pasuk says he shall offer it, this refers to receiving the blood in the kli. Ata omer Kabbalah sadam. You say that's Kabbalah sadam. Inu ela zrika. Maybe it actually refers to zrika. Kishu omer v'zarku hare zrika. When it says v'zarku, we'll say it's pretty clear. Zarku refers to zrika. Amar hama ani makayim v'krivo. So what is v'krivo? Zu Kabbalah sadam. We'll say that ultimately again refers to Kabbalah sadam. So we'll say, so therefore, just so you understand, so the Gemara is understanding now the pasuk of v'hikrivo, or the word v'hikrivo. V'krivo b'nei Aaron hakohanim sadam. V'krivo means Kabbalah. That means the act of receiving the blood in the kli sharis. So says the Gemara, V'krivo zo Kabbalah sadam b'nei Aaron hakohanim. We'll say when it says the sons of Aaron the kohanim, shetehei b'kohen kasher u'b'kli sharis. So we'll say, what does this mean? It means that Kabbalah must be done with a kohen kasher, a valid kohen, and kli sharis. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. In this context, Rashi points out over here, normally kli sharis means what? Means what? Service utensils. Service utensils. Rashi points out over here that that's not what it means in this context. If you look in the second to last of the short lines, before the lines get wide, ubekli sharis sheyehei melubashim bigdei kahuna. Rashi in the sense, kli sharis over here means bigdei kahuna. So Kabbalah must be done by kohanim ksherim who are wearing bigdei kahuna. Amar Rabbi Akiva, minayin la Kabbalah shelo tehei ela bekohen kasher bekli sharis. So Rabbi Akiva will say, so Rabbi Akiva has his own version of this. From where do we know that Kabbalah has to be done with a kohen kasher and while he's wearing his kohanic vestments? Ne'emar kan b'nei Aaron. It says over here b'nei Aaron, we'll say by Kabbalah. The ne'emar lahalon elish mos b'nei Aaron hakohanim hameshuchim. And we'll say it says later on that these are the names of the sons of Aaron hameshuchim that were anointed with the shemen hamishcha. The Gemara says, "Ma lahalon b'kohen kosher b'kli sharis." Just like Rabbi say in the second passage, we're referring ultimately again to kohanim who are ksherim and to wear the kohanic vestments. Afkan b'kohen kosher u'b'kli sharis. So to over here, Rabbi, we're talking about a kohen kosher and the kli sharis. Says the Gemara. So we'll say, so that's Rabbi Kiva. So Rabbi Kiva pretty much just understand made it's the same drasha. He's just learning it out a little bit differently. So we'll say what we have over here so far is as follows: the pasuk of vehikrivo b'shachat esabachar lefnei Hashem vehikrivo b'nei Aaron. Vehikrivo is Kabbalah, even though the word ekrivo translates as what? As sacrifice. In this context, it means Kabbalah. What do we learn about Kabbalah? We'll say this is really interesting halachas. What do we just learn about Kabbalah? What do we learn about Kabbalah? Has to be done by a kohen kosher and kli sharis. Has to be wearing his kohanic clothing. Good. Hold on. I'm Rabbi Tarfon. Ekpach es bonai. So it's a very strong wording. So I said, the literally says, Akapach es bonai means I will bury my sons. Im lo shamati lahavchin hefresh ben kabbalah lizrika ve'ini lefarish. So we'll say, Rabbi Tarfon said essentially, I swear, right? I swear like by my sons' lives that I learned a distinction between Kabbalah and Zrika, and I can't for the life of me remember. So we'll say, why would Rabbi Tarfon say such a thing like that? I should bury my sons and I can't remember. He's obviously a bit frustrated with this, right? We'll say, so meaning he knows that he learned something, he can't remember that which he learned. We'll say, by the way, it's an incredible musar, because halavai, we should be so frustrated when we can't remember something in our learning. Right? Sometimes we don't remember something from a Gemara or something. We say, all right, not a big deal. I'll see it in 7.5 years. I'll get back to it again next cycle. Let's say the idea that when a person feels so close to their Torah, that ultimately, again, when they can't remember it, there's a profound sense of angst and frustration. Is an incredible level. In any event, so the Gemara says, so essentially, Rabbi Tarfon is very upset, very distressed, because Lamaisa, he remembers that he learned about the distinction between Kabbalah and Zrika, but he can't remember what that distinction was. And with Rabbi Akiva, Ani Afarish, Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Tarfon, don't worry, I'm going to tell you the difference. So it says the Gemara, Ani Afarish, Kabbalah lo asa machshava kemaisa. But when it comes to Kabbalah, so machshava is not kemaisa. We'll say, what does that mean? When Rabbi Akiva is saying, and this is, we'll say, remember again, up until now, to be very honest, what the Gemara has been discussing has not really had any kind of bearing on our Mishnah. Remember how this whole conversation started. The Mishnah told me that even if I have in mind even if I'm do Kabbalah, Shalol Lishma, ultimately that invalidates the Karban. Now we'll say you're going to see why this whole discussion came up. So Rabbi Tarfon says, I remember that there's a distinction between Kabbalah and Zrika, but I can't remember what it is. Rabbi Akiva tells us, I'm going to tell you what it is. Kabbalah, lo asa machshava kemaisa. We'll say when it comes to Kabbalah, we do not make machshava kemaisa. We'll say now, what does that mean? If you look at Rashi, it is 6 lines down in the wide lines of Rashi. Lo asa machshava kemaisa, hashto sakadaitcha, hadika amar in machshava poseles bishvila, in chishev ba chutz lizmano, o shelo lishmo, amalo pasla beKabbalah. We'll say something what Rabbi Akiva is saying is that a shelo lishma kavana by Kabbalah, any type of erroneous mindset by Kabbalah, does not invalidate Kabbalah. As opposed to Zrika, ultimately again asaba machshava kimaisa. So we'll say by Kabbalah, if I manage to do something physically wrong, that invalidates the avoda. But if I just have a wrong mindset, that doesn't invalidate the avoda. Mashiach came by Zrika, whether I had an erroneous mindset or an erroneous thought, it invalidates the avoda. Kiblo bachutz eno chayiv kares. Furthermore, if you do Kabbalah outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're not chayiv kares. Zarku bachutz. If you do Zrika outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're chayiv kares. Kablu psulin ein chayav and alav. Both say if somebody who is a psul, either who is a pasul kohen or not a kohen at all, does Kabbalah, they are not chayiv misa for that act. Zarku psulin chayiv misa. But if ultimately again non-kohen or pasul kohen does Zrika, they will be chayiv misa. So Rabbi Akiva says these are the distinctions between Kabbalah and Zrika. So what's so beautiful? Amar lo Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon says ha'avoda. What's the ha'avoda means? I swear by the Beis Hamikdash, at hitis yamin usmol. You did not deviate right or left from what the true halacha is. In other words, Rabbi Tarfon is essentially saying, spot on. right? Spot on. Excellent. Ani shemati ve'eni lefarish. Shabbos saying, here's the godless of this. Rabbi Tarfon says, I heard the shir, right? Ani shemati, I heard this teaching. Ve'eni lefarish, and I wasn't able to recall it. Ata doresh umaskim l'shmua. You, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva never heard a shir. Rabbi Akiva came up with this distinction based on his own learning. So Rabbi Tarfon was blown away by the fact that he essentially was spoon-fed the information but couldn't recall it. Rabbi Akiva came up with it on his own. But listen to this. When I say came up with it on his own, I mean he didn't invent it, meaning he learned it on his own. So also listen to how beautiful this is. Rabbi Tarfon used this lashon to Rabbi Akiva, and he said, Akiva, kala poresh mimcha ke poresh mechayev. So beautiful. Akiva, anyone who goes ahead and separates from you, separates from life. In other words, Akiva, everyone should attach themselves to you because you have a mastery of Torah like no one else. So we'll say, first of all, these words are exceptionally profound as well on a different level. You know, Rabbi Akiva, I often feel that one could credit the fact that Am Yisrael is still so vibrant and so healthy to this day, despite all of the adversity and tragedies, to Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva really was the embodiment of hope, the embodiment of optimism, the embodiment of the mindset that says no matter what happens, you know, Yeshuas Hashem will always come. The Hashem will always be there by our side. So it's very profound to Akiva kala porish mimcha ke porish mechayiv. To separate from Rabbi Akiva, it's like separating from life. You can't separate from Rabbi Akiva, his mindset. Can't separate from his halachas. Can't separate from his hashkafas hachayim. Because if you do, you run the risk of mamish losing out on the ability to live life. Amar Rava. So we'll say. So okay. Bottom line, back to our regularly scheduled program. So what's the issue over here? We'll say the issue over here is Rabbi Akiva said quite explicitly that what? That you could do Kabbalah Shalol Lishma. You could do Kabbalah Shalol Lishma does not invalidate the carbon. We'll say that is an often a stira, right? That is an explicit contradiction to our Mishnah. Because the Mishnah says that what? That if Kabbalah is done Shalol Lishma, the Kabbalah will be invalid. Amar Rava says, Lo Kashya, Kan b'machshavas pigol, Kan b'machshavas Shalol Lishma. Rava says it's not a question, and we'll say why. Because it's talking about two different types of machshavas. One is about machshava of pigol, and one is shlosh. So we're going to spend a significant amount of time speaking about pigol today. What is pigol? Pigol means any time that a kohen does one of the avodas with the intention of consuming the carbon outside of its community. I will say, I'll tell you something amazing. This week's parsha. Pigol is this week's parsha, Parshas Kedoshim. Right? So we'll say, so again, if a kohen does the avoda and he has in mind to consume the carbon outside of the permitted window, that endows the carbon with the designation of pigol. So we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Machshavas pigol. It's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. Machshavas pigol. Dichutz lizmano lo pasla beKabbalah. So we'll say, ultimately, again, if a kohen has machshavas pigol by Kabbalah, that will not invalidate the carbon. That's what Rabbi Akiva was saying. But the Mishnah is talking about if a person has a machshava shalol lishma, that will invalidate the carbon. That will invalidate the carbon. So we'll say, see here this distinction, machshavas, and we'll discuss why this is. Machshavas pigol by Kabbalah will not invalidate the carbon. Machshavas shalol lishma by Kabbalah will invalidate the carbon. To which the Gemara says, Well, I say furthermore, again, this seems to read beautifully into the Mishnah, because what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says that if you have a kavanah shalol lishma by Kabbalah, then what Rabbi say? The carbon is nifsal. If we're talking about pigol, then the Mishnah would have said what? Nitpagel. Those nispagel, right? Nispagel, right? So we'll say the idea would have been, so the Mishnah would have talked, if the Mishnah was talking about pigol, then it would have used lashon nispagel. It doesn't say nispagel, instead it just says nifsa. So we'll say, what comes out of here is as follows. The distinction the Gemara is trying to make is like this. When the Mishnah tells me that a wrong kavana by Kabbalah could invalidate the carbon, that's dafka a shelo lishmo kavana. But if one had a machshavas pigol during Kabbalah, which means that at the time the kohen is receiving the blood in the vessel, he has in mind that he's going to consume the carbon in 4 days from now, that's pigol, that does not invalidate Kabbalah. Good. Umachshavas pigol or pasal by Kabbalah. So I will say now, after we just said it like as a fact, the Gemara says, really? Is that true? That if you have a machshavas pigol by Kabbalah, it doesn't invalidate the Kabbalah, it doesn't invalidate the Avoda. But remember again, when we say invalidate the Kabbalah, you understand that once you invalidate the Kabbalah, then what? Then what? The Karban. And so remember again, the only potential swing Avoda, when I say swing Avoda, is the only potential Avoda that may not compromise the Karban in its entirety, as we already saw in the Mishnah, was what? Was holacha. Right? That was the one, and we'll discuss that in further depth. But it's clear that if you compromise the Shechita, Shechita and Zrika, it's certainly, the Karban is certainly compromised. Kabbalah, we just wanted to say, it's only if you have Machshava Shal L'Shma. Machshavas Pigel doesn't compromise the Karban. The Gemara now is just questioning that. Is that true? Machshavas Pigel lo pasla by Kabbalah. Is that true? That if a Machshava Pigel by Kabbalah doesn't validate the Karban? Vatanya, we learned, I might have thought that Machshava doesn't have an impact on a Karban in general, and the only time Machshava has an impact of is where? Is by Zrika. Minayim l'rabos Shchita v'Kabbalah. But say, from where do I know to go ahead and also include Shchita and Kabbalah? Talmud Lomar. The pasuk says, the pasuk quoting over here, Im he'achol ye'achel mibisar zevach shlamav pigolhu. But actually, Im he'achol ye'achel mibisar zevach shlamav bayom hashlishi lo yiratzah makriva so lo yechashev lo pigol yihya. So watch this, I will say. So the pasuk says, "Pigol lo yiratzeh b'darm hamavim l'diachila kasav medaber." So we'll say, interestingly enough, the only things that make a Karban into pigol is when the Kohen has the wrong machshava by navoda that ultimately brings one to achila, that ultimately is a gateway avoda to consumption. So b'darm hamavim l'diachila kasav medaber. Yochel shani marbe ashvich ashirayim. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. Take a look for just a moment. The Rashi, Bidvarim HaMaviyim, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. Bidvarim HaMaviyim, Es HaKarban Lidei Heter Achila Kosav Medaber. So we'll say what's interesting is as follows. The Pasuk links Achila with Pigul to teach me that what? That I'm only chayiv, a wrongful machshava of eating a Karban outside of its prescribed time is only problematic if I have that machshava by an avoda, which is a gateway to consumption, a gateway avoda to consumption. But the Gemara says, but that's what it means. B'dram hamavim l'de'achila kasem medaber. Yochal shanimar ba'ashvich hashirayim v'aktares emurin. We'll say I might have thought that the Karban can become pigul, even if I have the erroneous mindset. We'll say shvich hashirayim means the spilling of the leftover blood down the base of the altar. Haktares emurin means burning the leftover limbs and fats. Talmud lomar. So the Gemara says Zrika b'chlal haisa. So Zrika, I will say, was included in the general klal, and yet v'lama yasa. So why was it singled out? Lahakish eler. I will say ultimately again that it should serve as the hekish. Lomar lacha to teach you the following. Mazrika miyuchadesh shiavoda umechaperes umaakeves kapara. So it's like just like Zrika is unique in that what it is part of the sacrificial service. Umechaperes, and it atones. Umaakeves kapara, and I both say if you don't do Zrika, it prevents kapara from occurring. Avkol avoda umaakeves kapara. Both say so too again. I both say what makes a Karban pigul, or both say what type of avodos, if you have the wrong mindset, can make a Karban pigul. Only avodos which are like Zrika, namely, it's an avoda, it's part of the sacrificial service. Umaakeves kapara. And if you don't do it, then what? Then what? It prevents kapara from occurring. What does that exclude? Yatsu shvicha shirayim v'aktaras emurin she'im ma'akvenes hakapara. I will say that excludes what? That excludes the spilling out of the leftover blood, the burning of the leftover fats and limbs, which I will say, if you don't do those things, it is not ma'akev kapara. Therefore, I will say, if at the time that the Kohen is pouring out the leftover blood, he has in mind to eat the Karban 4 days later, does that make the Karban pigul? No. No. So we'll say, before we get to the application of this is an incredibly profound principle. So we've always thought that pigul is just any time you have in mind at any point of the Karban to eat it out of its prescribed time that it's pigul. The Gemara says no. It only becomes pigul, I will say, if it's what's called if you have the wrong mindset by an essential avoda. What's the definition of essential avoda? A, it has to be called an avoda. B, it has to be something that is necessary to kapara. But if it's not necessary to kapara, then the wrong mindset will not go ahead and invalidate it. So we'll say it's now, what we see over here is using this particular paradigm using this particular paradigm, if that's the case, it would appear that if you have the wrong mindset by Kabbalah, that would also invalidate the carbon. So if the Kohen is going ahead, I will say, and during Kabbalah, has in mind to eat the carbon 5 days later, then what? Then halacha l'maaseh, the carbon should be pasul. Why I will say? Because what is Kabbalah? Kabbalah isn't avoda. Is Kabbalah ma'akiv kapara? Right? Does it? If you don't do Kabbalah, does it compromise the carbon? And the answer is yes. If that's the case, that it's avoda and it's ma'akiv kapara, then that should mean that what? That if the Kohen has in mind to eat the carbon 5 days later, that's pigul and should invalidate the carbon. You have to say, what did we just say before? That by Kabbalah, only shelo lishma will invalidate the avoda, but pigul will not. Here we see that using the principle just espoused by the Gemara, pigul should invalidate by Kabbalah as well. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Ella, we'll say Amud Beis. Ella, lo kasha, not a contradiction. Ha de amar harini shochet amanas lekabel dama lemachar. So we'll say, watch this. So the Gemara says everything depends on the machshava, right? Everything depends on the machshava. Ha de amar, we'll say, when do we say it's not pigul? That's when he says harini shochet amanas lekabel dama lemachar. That's when he says I'm shechting the animal on the condition to go ahead and receive the blood tomorrow. Hada amar harini mekabel dama amanas lishboch shirayim lemachar. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the case where it's not pigul, both sides, where a person says, harini, all right, I'm going to shech the animal on the condition that I'm going to receive the blood tomorrow, versus when he says I'm receiving the blood on the condition, ultimately again, that I'm going to spill out the blood tomorrow. We'll say that first case is not pigul, that second case is pigul. Now we'll see the distinction between those two cases in just a moment. So the Gemara is supposed to, on a basic level, what you understand is as follows: Shvichas shirayim rabosai is after already consumption could occur. So in a case where he says I'm going to be makabel the dam on the condition ultimately to pour out the shirayim later on tomorrow, indicates that he's delaying consumption as well. Once you're delaying consumption, that's where you get into an issue of pigul. So we'll say there was one of the rabbis who said to Rabbah, Ushvichas shirayim vaktaras emurim lo paslu behu machshava. We'll say, so now here's what we've established. What we've established is that in achinami, even by Kabbalah, you could have machshavas pigul, right? Pigul could go ahead and pasl by Kabbalah as well. We'll say now, one thing we just established is, the Gemara seems to be saying, that once you already get to the point of spilling out the leftover blood, or the burning of the leftover fats and limbs, there, machshavas pigul does not make any difference. Because we'll say those avodos, those things are no longer really called avoda, and they're still in ma'akiv kapara. So the Gemara says, v'aktaras emurin lo paslabu, excuse me, so ushvichas dam v'aktaras emurin lo paslabu machshava, is that true? That by the spilling out of the leftover blood, or the burning of the leftover limbs and fats, that if you have, Rabbosai, a machshavas pigul, to eat the carbon later on, that it doesn't passel. So the Gemara says, but we learned, I might have thought that machshavas pigul, we'll say, only applies to achilas basar, that the only time, we'll say, that you could render a carbon pigul is if you have an erroneous mindset about when you're going to consume sacrificial meat. That if you say I'm going to consume sacrificial meat outside of the permitted time, minayin l'rabos shvichos shirayim vaktares emurin, we'll say, how do I know that it comes to include, even if you have an erroneous mindset, by the spilling out of the leftover blood and the burning of the limbs? Talmud lomar v'im he'achal ye'achel b'shtei achilos hakasav medaber. So we'll say, interesting enough, the Gemara is dashing over here, he'achal ye'achel, 2 acts of consumption. We'll say, what are the 2 acts of consumption? Achas achilas adam v'achas achilas mizbeach. 2 acts of consumption, I will say. The Kohen eats one, or the Bailim, whatever the particular carbon, and the Mizbeach eats one. Which I will say tells you what? That ultimately, again, the Gemara is suggesting that there could be pigul even by the consumption of the altar. What's the consumption of the altar? The spilling out of the leftover blood and the burning of the fats and the limbs. That's the consumption of the altar. So it sounds like over here, that's what? That even if you have the wrong mindset by the spilling out of the extra blood and the burning of the fats and the limbs, that could also render the carbon pigul. To which the Gemara says, Lokashya, Hada Amar Harini Zorek, Amanas Lishboch Shiraim Lamachar. So we'll say this is by a case where he says, I'm doing the zrika on the condition to spill out the leftover blood tomorrow. Hada Amar Harini Shofech Shirayim Al Manas Lahaktir Emur Lamachar. We'll say here is where he says, I'm going ahead and pouring out the leftover blood on the condition, ultimately, again, to burn the leftover limbs tomorrow. So we'll say, what's this distinction? Look at Rashi. First Rashi on the daf. Lo kash yaha de mekarvi, the kamerabi shricha shirayim. We'll say, what is the case where you can make a carbon pigel even by the spilling out of leftover blood? Kigon da'amar harmini zorek o achas mishar avodos amanas lishbok shayim lamachar. We'll say, if when he's doing one of the avodas, he says, I'm going to spill out the blood at a later date, in other words, after the prescribed time. So we'll say, in that case, when during the zrika, he has in mind to allow carbonic, or I should say, we'll call it carbonic, not carbonic, mizbeach consumption to occur at a later date. We'll say that's when it can become pigol. Ha dima'atin le'el kigon damarini shofech shirayim klala demilsa binamachsha b'shas avoda al davar achilas adam olam mizbeach hilchach. So listen to this. So the Gemara essentially says as follows: if you go ahead and you have in mind by the zrika, which is one of the avodas, that you're going to pour the blood outside of the prescribed time, then that's pigul. That's pigul. Why? Because I will say you're doing two things. Number one, you're having the machshava during one of the avodas. That's a necessary piece, and you are delaying consumption. Which consumption, Rabbi say? Mizbeach consumption. So if you're having in mind to delay mizbeach consumption, and you're having that erroneous mindset during one of the avodas, then inachinami that could make pigul. However, shofek shirayim amanas laktir emur lamachar. Let's say during the pouring out of the blood, you have in mind the leftover blood that you're going to burn the leftover limbs tomorrow. We'll say that doesn't create pigul. Why not? Because the act of pouring out the blood is not an avoda, and any erroneous mindset during a non-avoda ultimately again will not create pigul. So I will say, so bottom line for us, what's the takeaway? So the takeaway I will say is number one, that Kabbalah, erroneous mindset by Kabbalah, does in fact have the ability to go ahead and invalidate the carbon. And I will say not only that, but what we've also established is that halacha l'maisa, you can have a case of pigul even by Kabbalah as well. Just the Gemara says it only occurs under certain defined circumstances. Weiter. Amr Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Chia. Shamati. I heard. Well, so this is actually a fascinating case. Shetvilas etzba mefageles bechatos penimis. Well, so listen to this. What is this case over here? Look at Rashi. Shamati mirabose shetvilas etzba ha'omar bechatos ha'penimios v'tavala koin etzbo mefageles bechatos imtava amanas lahaktim ramacha. Well, so listen to this. A chatos ha'penimios, which also means a chatos whose blood is sprinkled on the inside of the Beis Hamikdash. The paradigmatic example of this is Yom Kippur. Right? It's Yom Kippur. So we'll say, so the way that used to work is as follows. When you sprinkle blood of achatas hapnimius inside the Beis Hamikdash, so remember, normal zrika was often done how? Bikli. You would take the kli, I'm a lefty, but you're right, you would take it in your right hand. You would go ahead, actually, I'm sorry, taking your left hand as well, and you would throw it on the mizbeach, you could sprinkle it on the mizbeach. For chatas pnimius, Rabbi it didn't work that way. The Kohen would dip his finger in the blood and he would sprinkle it. Right? He would sprinkle it. Rabbi you know, this is in Musaf Chazar Sashas achas viachas achas ushtayim. I think people are still awake for that part. No, maybe not. Maybe they wake up for that again for that part. So they come back for that part, right? Right. So I'll say. So the idea over here is the following: What happens if halacha l'maisa, at the time that the Kohen dips his finger in the blood, he has a machshavas pigul. So at the time that he dips his finger in that blood, he has in mind that he's going to eat the carbon. Well, that carbon is not. He's going to eat the carbon, or he's going to burn the fats and the limbs 2 days later. He has a machshavas pigul. So we'll say, watch it. Some of you who read the Shamati shetvilas etzba mefageles bechatas penimis. And we'll say that if you have the wrong mindset when you dip your finger in the blood, that ultimately, again, that can invalidate the carbon. Shama Ilfa heard this. Amra kamei dirav pida. Amra klum lamanu pigol el mishlamim. But we'll say it doesn't make sense. I'll tell you why. Because we'll say, where do we learn that pigol from? So we'll say the halacha of pigol is stated in the context of shlamim. So listen to this. Ma l'shlamim ein tevilas etzma mifageles bohen. So we'll say when it comes to shlamim, if the Kohen dips his finger in the blood, and at the time that he dips his finger, has a machshavas pigol, We'll say, does that invalidate the carbon? And the answer is no. We'll say, now why not? Why is it that if the Kohen dips his finger in the blood of the shlamim and has a mindset to eat the carbon 2 days later, that it doesn't invalidate the carbon? Why not? Because it's not an avoda. It's not an avoda. So we'll say, Ilfa says, shlamim is the paradigm for pigul. If by shlamim you dip your finger inside the blood, it does not make the carbon pigul. So to by chatos, ultimately again, if you dip your finger in the blood and have a machshavas pigul, it does not create a problem. Says, but 1 second, just because pigul was taught in the context of shlamim, does that mean that in order to become pigul, it must exactly mirror shlamim? We'll say, listen to this. They will say the halacha is a carbon only becomes pigul if halacha l'maiset was otherwise kosher. But if the carbon was not kosher anyway, then it doesn't become pigul. So which means as follows: in pigul. So we'll say, remember again, let's say the shlamim was offered shalol lishman. So we'll say, what's the status of a shlamim offered up shalol lishman? It's still kosher. Still kosher. So we'll say, which means that shlamim that is offered shalol lishma could still become pigul. Avchata shalol lishma in motzim midei pigul. Rabbi say, now what's the halacha? The halacha is if a chatas is offered up shalol lishma, we'll say, then what's the halacha? The chatas is pasul. Rabbi say, which means that if the chatas is pasul, then what? It cannot become pigul. Rabbi say, it's just a unique, peculiar aspect of pigul. A carbon could only become pigul if it would have otherwise been kosher. But if the carbon would have otherwise been compromised anyway, it can't become pigul. So what happens if you offer up a shlamim shalol lishma? Could a shlamim shalol lishma become pigul? And the answer is yes. Why? Because a shlamim shalol lishma is still kosher anyway. What if a chatas was offered up shalol lishma? Could it become pigul? And the answer is no, because the chatas shalol lishma is going to be pasul. Ella ma'istechal meimar. So what do you have to say? Right? Miribuya dikrai ka'asya. We'll say what you have to say ultimately again is that we learn this from the riboy in the pasuk. Look at Rashi. So you have to say, and we'll see this later on, that ultimately again the idea that all karbanos are included in the halachos of pigul rabosai is learned that from a riboy later on. Therefore, because it's learned that from a riboy later on, we'll say it need not mirror shlamim. We'll say first why line given on the base hachanami miribuya dekrakasi. I'm going to be sure Levi. So we'll say so again. So now it sounds like over here we'll say that what we're saying is that halacha lemaisa by a chatos, if the coin dips in chatos pnimis, where the blood is sprinkled on the inside, if the coin when he dips his finger into the blood has a machshavas pigul, then what? The carbon is invalid. It doesn't resemble shlamim, and shlamim is the paradigm for pigul. No, it's not. No, it's not. We'll say shlamim is where the halacha of pigul is taught, but we learn out all other, because there's a riboy stated elsewhere as well as we will see. So both say, so the Gemara Rabbi Shmuel Levi, Ba'aliyah Zushnamati, in this attic, so apparently they were standing in the attic, in this attic I heard, Shetvilas Etzva Mefageles, that ultimately again by Achatas Pnimis, if the Kohen dips his finger into the blood and has it by the Machshavas Pigul, that it makes the carbon Pigul. So Toi by Rabbi Shimon Lakish. So also Rabbi Shimon Lakish, he wondered about this. Rabbi Shimon Lakish, excuse me. Klum lamdu pigul elam. So also it's the same conversation. Klum lamdu pigul elam mishlamim. Do we not learn out the concept of pigul from shlamim? Mash shlamim ein tevilas etzba mefagelas. Just like by shlamim, we'll say if you dip your finger in the blood with the wrong mindset, it doesn't make the carbon pigul. Avchatos ein tevilas etzba mefagelas. So to by chatos, we'll say the dipping of the finger in the blood also shouldn't make it pigul. V'chiyakol mishlamim lamdu. We'll say, but it's everything learned out from shlamim. If you offer up the shlam shalol lishma, it doesn't, right? This animal could still, the carbon could still become pigul. So would you say, therefore, because shlamim, even if you offer it up shalol lishma, it still become pigul? Chatas could also become pigul if offered up shalol lishma. We'll say, that's unequivocally untrue, right? That lamaisa again, if a chatas is offered up shalol lishma, it's possible. Therefore, it can't become pigul. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina ein hakin. Hakom mishlamim lamdu. But I'll say, so Rabbi Yosef says, you're right. Means yes. Everything is really learned out from shlamim. The Gemara says, Hoil v'chutzlim komo posel b'shlamim v'shelo lishmo posel b'chatos. So we'll say, just like what? Chutzlim komo, if you offer up the carbon outside of its prescribed area, it passes by shlamim. So, and if you offer up shalosh shmo passes by chatos, machutz lim komo. haposel b'shlamim motzi midei pigul. Just like I will say, if you were to offer up the shlam chutz lim komo, and therefore the carbon is puzzle, it could not become pigul. Af shelo lishmo haposel b'chatos motzi midei pigul. So I will say, if you offer up the carbon shelo lishmo by chatos, ultimately, and therefore that makes it puzzle, it can't become pigul either. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah mitzida tavra. I could ask Krishna about that I could fundamentally undermine this. Ma lechutz lim komo haposel b'shlamim shekenoi b'chol hazvachim. Both say the idea of chutz lim komo, offering up a carbon outside of its prescribed area, and therefore the carbon being puzzle, is not unique to shlamim. Both say that is the general halacha by all karbanos. Tomar b'shlo l'shmo she'noig ela b'pesach v'chatas bilvad. The psul of shlo l'shmo both say is only something that applies to pesach and chatas. Ela ma'is l'chol meimar. Rather, again, what is there to say? Davar haposel bohen motziem midei pigul. Something Rabbi said that invalidates the carbon will also prevent it from becoming pigul. Davar ha'ma'akiv bohen meviem lidei pigul. Rabbi say ultimately again, this is two sides of the same coin. Rabbi say something that ultimately again invalidates the carbon will ultimately prevent it from becoming pigul. But a carbon could only become pigul if the machshavas pigul, Rabbi say, is done by a part of the avoda that is absolutely ma'akiv. Hachanami davar haposel ba motzi midei pigul. So to Rabbi say by chatos davar haposel ba, which means what Rabbi says, something that ultimately again invalidates the carbon, motzi midei pigul, prevents the carbon from becoming pigul. Davar hama'akiv ba mevia lidei pigul. So I'll say, in other words, what something that is an indispensable part of the avoda. If you have the wrong mindset by that particular thing, that could make the carbon pigul as well. Which I will say, for our purposes, means what? The dipping of the Kohen's finger into the blood of the chatas happening. Which I will say is what? Is a davar hama'akiv. It is a necessity. Because it is a necessity, therefore, what? If the Kohen has the wrong mindset to consume the carbon or to sprinkle the blood 5 days later, that will invalidate the carbon and make it into pigul. Omrad Mari Afana Nami Tanina. We also learn Zehaklal. This is the general principle. Kalakomates Vinosim Bekli. If the Kohen will actually just begin this, if the Kohen goes in and takes the kmitza, which is the 3 fingers full, v'nosin bekli, he puts it in the utensil, v'amolich, and then one takes it to the mizbeach, v'amakdir, one offers it up. So we'll say so again. In these cases, so zekla. So we'll say this is we'll see what this means in just a moment. Bishlam akometz hainu shochet. So we'll say, so now what the Gemara is doing is as follows, comparing the steps of the Karban Mincha to the regular steps of a sacrificial order. So watch this. Bishlam akometz hainu shochet. So we'll say kmitza is the equivalent of shchita. Molich hainu molich. So what's right? The taking of the kmitza to the mizbeach. So halacha is the same by both. Makdir hainu nami zore. So we'll say makdir, which means placing it on the mizbeach, is the same thing as zrika. Elanosin bekli mainu. So we'll say, what about the act of putting the kmitza into the utensil? Ilema the dami le kabbalah. If you want to say that it resembles kabbalah, mi dami, how can you say it resembles kabbalah? Hasamamela hacha iu kashakil. We'll say, here's the difference. By kabbalah of a regular carbon, we'll say, that is happening by itself, which means what? The Kohen shechs the animal, then what happens, Rabbi say? The blood spurts into the utensil. By kmitza, the Kohen is actively placing it there. So the Gemara says, Ihu kashakil v'rami, ela kevan de lo sagi de lo yoiv, al karche avoda chashuva. Rather, Rabbi say, what do you have to say? What you have to say is, kevan de lo sagi de lo yoiv, since the Kohen needs to place the kmitza into the klisharis, therefore what? It is considered to be an avoda. Hachinami, so to over here, Rabbi say, by the Kohen dipping his finger in the blood of the chatas hapenimis, kevan delo sagi delo avidle, since this is an indispensable part, is a necessity. Al karche hainu holacha. We'll say ultimately again it should be the equivalent ultimately again of holacha as well. To which the Gemara says, lo li'olam dedami la kabbalah. They will say the dipping of the finger into the blood could be comparable to kabbalah. V'tika amret hacham amela hasam iu kashakil. And I will say, the act of the Kohen of putting the kamitza into the utensil should be the equivalent of a general act of Kabbalah. You said before, no, they're dissimilar. Why? You said it was different because by the kamitza, the Kohen is actively placing it in. Masha'in came back, Kabbalah just comes in by itself. So the Gemara says, Kevan di idi matan klihu Mali mamela, mali kashakil, mali v'yav. I'll say, since at the end of the day, both cases are where the item is coming into the utensil, the flour, and then the blood. What does it make a difference if it's spurting in or if you're putting it in yourself? Rather, it's called Kabbalah. So we'll stop over here for today. Ultimately, again, just understand where we left off. Where we left off is now we brought in Karban Mincha, which we'll further expound on that in just a little bit. Rabbi said the fundamental shaila that the Gemara is still trying to assess is what is the status of when the Kohen dips his finger into the blood of the Chatas Penimis. We'll say if he has a wrongful mindset there, does he have the ability to render the Karban Pigel? I will say the fundamental shaila really hinges on what is the act of placing his finger into the blood a bona fide avoda or not. We'll say that's the fundamental shaila, and Amirat Hashem will continue with that.